Any more time, it's my pleasure to introduce Matthias Rebellius from Siemens, who is here to talk about their interest in this issue and the event, and then we'll get underway with our speakers. So thank you all very much for coming. Matthias.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Josh, and good afternoon, everyone here to the roundtable. I'm really pleased to be here and represent Siemens, not only in the Chicagoland area and the city of Chicago, but also at this event, talking about smart systems and resilient regions. So it's more than a city, and it's more than only smart. It's about resiliency, and resiliency has many patterns and facets to talk about. I'm the president of Building Technologies Americas, which is one of the divisions for Siemens globally. We are headquartered in Chicagoland area, which is in Buffalo Grove. We recently opened an office up here, right down the street at Clark Street. So we are very pleased to be in the city of Chicago and in the area of Chicago with our Americas headquarters. And so I'm also representing Siemens in city initiatives, the councils and the Chamber of Commerce and other activities, because it's so important that also the industry participates in thought leading, in discussing what the area needs, what needs to be done, and then also helps and has solutions and answers for implementing what needs to be done. And that's so important. That's our job. And also many things that Josh already mentioned are at the center of our offering, what Siemens can bring to the table. So it really goes from energy generation and distribution with transportation down to building technologies and the grid technology for the resilient grid and energy supply, which is so important. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more often through the day. And looking at Michael Masters, talking about security and what we can bring there as solutions for emergency management and security. It's so important. And is there any other place in the nation which is more worthwhile to protect and develop and retain than Chicago? I can tell you, when I came here 2 years ago with my family from Europe, we really, in Europe, everybody is talking about New York City, most likely because it's closer or because it's just an hour less flight. But if you get here, you really know what people are missing out on Chicago. The amazing architecture, the infrastructure, the history, the sports events, and the culture we have here in the city and in the area is really amazing. And also enjoying when we do have good weather conditions, enjoying Lake Michigan. And as someone said to me, you can enjoy Chicago summer almost both weeks. But it's my experience was different. We had a really good summer last year. I'm sure we will get one also this year. So overall, it's exciting city to contribute and to retain and to work in and to work on the infrastructure. This is what we do every day. We are present as Siemens in many iconic buildings and infrastructures here within the city. Talk about Soldier Field, Chicago Public Schools, O'Hare Airport, the Chicago parks, the universities, and the transportation system. So we are not everywhere, but in many areas. And we know what the city needs. We know what has been done already from in recent years and over decades in building the new Chicago and investing into our infrastructure here. And we certainly appreciate all that has been done also from a company's perspective, the business that we were allowed to do together with the city and the partners. And it's about partnerships. The partnership between the city, the county, and the private sector is so important, not only when it comes to financing, but obviously that's also an important part of the equation to make our city and our area more sustainable and resilient, and that's part of the overall equation, as I said already. Today we talk about smart systems and resilient regions. That's an important topic, and the weather conditions were already mentioned, and the weather events or extreme weather events, but it's more than that. It's also about security hazards and other threats that we have, and not only threats, but also challenges in terms of urbanization, more people coming to live in city areas. This is what we call the global trends for urbanization, and we have answers to that. We are continuously developing answers as a company together with our partners. And that's so important. Therefore, such a discussion as of today is also to gain insight and not only to provide our answers, but to develop the answers for the future. And therefore, it's so important, and I appreciate we are participating in the panel. We have a chance to talk to you all here and develop this so important topic forward for all of us. Delivering cutting-edge technology for, without sacrificing the heritage that we have here in the city of Chicago. And that's so important, and therefore I invite you all to lively listen and participate in the Q&A afterwards on this important topic. And with that, I want to give it back to the panel and Josh, who is moderating it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. So our first speaker today is Michael Masters from Cook County's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Office. He's going to come talk about what the county's doing, and as he walks up here, I'm going to switch over to his presentation. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me without the microphone? Well, we'll need it. Gotcha. The YouTube and my short little box that I'm required to stay in. Ah, great. So first of all, let me, while Josh gets the presentation up, thank everyone for the opportunity to be here with you today, as well as the Metropolitan Planning Council and, of course, Siemens. My boss speaks a lot about good corporate citizenship and social responsibility, so it's always a pleasure when you have a partner or a corporation that is in your community that is dedicated to bringing groups like this together and sponsoring events such as this. I think it speaks a lot about the partnership, the critical partnership that needs to develop more and more between the public and private as well as nonprofit and academic sectors. So I'm very appreciative for the opportunity to be here today. What I'd like to speak to you a little bit about, and it was brought up earlier by both speakers, is a little bit about our great city and our urban area, but how that plays into our threat picture. And it plays into it in a number of different ways, and what Cook County is doing to address it, and how all of you are, many of the organizations that are represented here in this room are currently partners of ours or can be partners, and some of the challenges that we're looking to in the future. And many of the things that were just mentioned that make our urban area great. We're world-class architectural capital. We have more Class 1 railways coming into our city as an intermodal transportation hub than almost anywhere else in the country. We have more buildings over 1,000 feet in height than any other major U.S. city. Of course, we're the hometown to the President of the United States, as well as a significant number of his cabinet. And all of this, in addition to making us a world-class city, also puts us on the radar of individuals who would wish our country and our city harm. And it's for that reason that our beautiful skyline has appeared not once but twice in Inspire magazine, which is Al-Qaeda's largest English language recruitment publication. It is the reason partially why in October of 2010, 2 jetliners from Yemen, which made a stopover at London Heathrow's airport, carried with them printer cartridges that were, well, they were bombs disguised as printer cartridges that were addressed to 2 synagogues here in the city of Chicago. And is why we have seen any number of threats directed against our city, of course, is a much broader picture of the over 55 Islamist-inspired terrorist plots which have been disrupted since September 11th, 2001 here in our country. But that's only one part of the threat that we face, because really our most pernicious and active adversary is not a man or a woman, it's Mother Nature. And it is a threat that we face every year, day in and day out. It is why, in many respects, I've become a part-time meteorologist in my position of looking at weather on a constant basis. And I can tell you that from our conversations with the National Weather Service that we don't anticipate a lot of flooding this evening in the Des Plaines corridor. For those of you that live there, one of the President's Chief of Staff certainly does, so I like to make sure that I'm up on the weather in that area. But these are the threats and issues that we face as an urban area, and it is why we have moved increasingly along with FEMA and DHS and the federal government to what we refer to as a whole community all hazards approach. Because the reality is the systems that we implement, the resiliency that we exercise and train and plan for, should be adaptive whether it's a man-made event or a natural event. Because regardless of what incident causes a structure to collapse, the response and recovery, the technology and information tools that we're using to prepare for or respond to the event are often very, very similar. So, this is our planning cycle, that all hazards, whole community idea. And this is our mission in a nutshell, to prevent, protect against, mitigate the effects of, respond to, and recover from all hazards, whether man-made or natural. Now, if anyone really enjoys FEMA information bulletins, you should recognize this information immediately. Our mission is similar to exactly what FEMA outlines because we are joined as partners in many of our exercises and events, as well as because they are a significant grant funder of ours, and that just seems prudent to me. What does this look like in real life, however? So let's go back very quickly to April 2013. April 2013 this year, on the 17th of April, was a pretty nice day, which contrasted with April 2013 of last year, where we had widespread flooding. Record high water levels. The Des Plaines River crested at 10.88 feet. We hadn't seen that hydrology level in roughly 4 to 6 decades. And there wasn't a great deal of rainfall. It just happened to be that because of the winter that we had and the water saturation of our ground and the water tables being where they were at, a small amount of water caused a great deal of discomfort and problems for us. So we had multiple road closures, which of course can affect everything from transportation routes and business to our first responders trying to deploy in ambulances or the fire services. Service disruptions, some of our best partners between ComEd and others that we were working with. Home and business evacuations. For the first time, Cook County was working hand in hand with the Coast Guard to actually rescue people out of their homes in Forest View and Riverside using Coast Guard assets. Very few people expect the Coast Guard to show up at their front door. That day they did, along with us, and we were glad to do it. Overall, FEMA recognized roughly $9.2 million worth of damage, but the damage assessment was much, much higher. And just some of the images from Des Plaines that day, that's the Des Plaines thumb, the before and after picture. Major arterial streets. And so the question that we always have is, how do we get from here back to here? So a major part of what we do is planning. And to give you a sense of how that starts for us, a threat hazard identification and risk assessment is a process that for the first time the City of Chicago and Cook County collaboratively undertook. It is the first time our urban area has ever had a comprehensive THIRA. This looks at everything from man-made to natural hazards. It's a 4-part process, and it feeds into all of our other planning efforts. One of which, most importantly in general, but certainly for today, is a hazard mitigation program. So Cook County was required to have a hazard mitigation plan. The requirement has been a federal law since 2000. As with many things, prior to my boss, Tony Preckwinkle, being elected as Cook County Board President in 2010, the county had never completed this critical federal requirement. They'd also never completed the THIRA. We got to work very quickly with our partners at the City of Chicago, the State of Illinois, FEMA Region 5, and others, individuals such as the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, who's a primary planning partner of ours, ComEd and others, to start implementing the hazard mitigation program. We will submit this to FEMA in June. It will be the largest HMP in the United States ever submitted to date. We have more municipal participation, more public input into this HMP than any other plan anywhere else in the country. And this is critical because it makes funding and dollars available to local communities and strategic partners for them to recover from or plan for issues. Moving forward, the development of emergency operations plans, COOP plans and COG plans, all things that we need many of you in this room to be working on with us. Moving right along to training, one of the things that we believe very strongly in is investing in human capital, because technology is critically important. But technology has a lifespan, usually for us in government between 3 to 5 years. If we can invest in our first responders and our people, they can not only use the technology that we're making short-term investments on, but we're giving them skill sets that, as I like to say, a police officer or a fireman will use for the next 30 or 40 years of his career. Every time he steps out of a police car or off a fire rig, he or she will use those skill sets. And when we can enhance those with technology, we're creating an even deeper layer of resiliency. So we have launched one of the largest training and exercise programs of any urban area here in the United States, and we've done it all within the last 36 months under the President's leadership. And that gets us to what does this look like in an actual event. So we created a duty desk, which is our 24/7 information and intelligence sharing hub. One of the things that we seek to do is to create a common operating picture for all of our partners. And the technology assets that we deploy are absolutely critical in this. So we are always tracking information. To give you a sense of one sort of system that we use, weather awareness software. We work very strongly with the National Weather Service, but we've also developed with a strategic partner of ours a weather awareness tool, which is a web-based ArcGIS tool, which allows us to have an accuracy rate of about 35% more efficiency, with 35% more efficiency than the National Weather Service, that they have the opportunity to avail themselves of as well. That tool works along with our human assets and our intelligence section. So we've significantly enhanced the county's capacity in this area, whether it's putting somebody on the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is a first in recent memory for Cook County, to working with our partners at the Regional Fusion Center, which is located at the Chicago Police Department. It used to be 50 feet from my old office when I was the chief of staff there. The county did not regularly staff our Regional Fusion Center. There was no communication going back and forth. Thanks to the leadership of the president and the mayor and the city-county collaboration, we have enhanced the partnerships. I talk more to my counterpart at the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois now in a day than our predecessors probably spoke to one another in 3 or 4 years combined. And that is not an over-exaggeration. And when they did talk previously, they were mostly yelling, so it wasn't productive conversation. Federal partners, key stakeholders, rail, utilities, et cetera, to ensure transportation, continuity of services. And as the situation develops, we move into an operational phase. We developed an incident management software. We selected it collaboratively between the City of Chicago, Cook County, the State of Illinois, and FEMA Region 5. It is the first time in the United States that all of those different levels of government were in the same room and working off of a similarly staged incident management platform. How can we work together in addressing issues if we're all looking at different images of what those issues are? So for the first time, we have a common operating picture that is truly universal amongst us. We use this on a daily basis. I believe that you train like you play, so I don't want my people firing on a system the first time that we have an issue or an incident. We use it every day so that when the uh-oh happens, we're used to operating on the systems that we use. It's a bad time to figure out something's not working, right, when you need it that day. And this helps us with everything from extreme weather to law enforcement operations, power outages, and train derailments. And just skipping through it, what we've done is we've pre-staged equipment across the county to deploy out across 3 different zones. We divide ourselves into north, central, and south. So that way our time on target, generally from the time we choose to deploy till arriving at a situation anywhere in this 946 square mile county, is about less than 62.5 minutes. I'm also a big believer in data-driven metrics, as you can tell. FEMA says be self-sufficient for 72 hours. We go with 96. Always better to err on the side of caution. And if I ask this question to all of you in the room, if we're talking about resiliency on the government level, let's talk about resiliency on the personal level. How many of you have enough water, clothing, or food in your car or in your house to last you for 72 hours, pre-staged and ready to go? 2 in the room. That's actually usually better than what we usually get. If we're going to talk resiliency seriously, we need to do it ourselves. We need to live it and breathe it. If something happens and you need to get out of your home or out of your office, we need to be ready for it. So we mobilize equipment through mobile response teams. They range in size from small, medium, and large, or tall, grande, and vente, depending on what life you like to lead. The question is, does this really matter to us? And in our minds, it does. And where did this particularly strike me? Has anyone read the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review? No. It's a riveting it's actually a very interesting document. This is the document the Department of Defense puts out, which is the overarching idea of our war-fighting strategy as a nation. And more significantly than any other year, they pinpoint climate change as a key issue in this country's national security and how we are going to address training our troops and engaging in a war-fighting strategy. Because the Defense Department recognizes that it will impact everything from supply chain movements to training of troops. A huge number of our bases are located in areas that, as climate change continues, will find themselves underwater. And I say this because I'm not interested in the politics of climate change. I think Mother Nature will do just fine in 20 or 30 or 40,000 years or a billion years. The question is, how is it impacting us and our economies and our national security? And the Quadrennial Defense Review puts it pretty starkly, that it is impacting our national security and our national defense, and so we need to take it seriously. And more close to home, if we look here in the state of Illinois, in 2011, 11 of the 14 U.S.-related disasters with damages of over $1 billion affected the Midwest. We are seeing increased levels of precipitation year in and year out, and the numbers are staggering. And it is why the 100-year flood, which people joke about, has become nearly an annual flood. A recent analysis by FEMA of climate change found that the risk of flooding showed that Illinois counties, that includes Cook, can expect a 40 to 90% increase in the size of areas susceptible to flooding by the end of the century. This has dramatic implications for our technology that we need to be deploying, for our economies, as well as just basically our first responders and our livelihood. Everything from agriculture and farming to the air we breathe is being affected. 20 million Americans in the Midwest are breathing what would be considered substandard quality air because of related to climate change issues. So these issues have an effect not only on our personal health and well-being, but our economy. And of course, as temperatures rise, that has added effects on forestation. Drought issues affect our farming economy, and so on and so forth. So the idea is trying to get ahead of this with the technology systems that we employ, as well as our basic thinking about how we're working to address these issues. Another one that I frequently talk about, power outages. And this really goes to a larger issue of resiliency in general, and how prepared are we? And I always bring up the example of the 2003 Northeast power outage, which affected tens of millions of people around our country and was due at the end of the day to a computer glitch, a very minor non-intended computer glitch, and a broken tree branch. And Judy, who's in the back of the room, always knows that I bring up squirrels too, because squirrels always cause power outages. They chew through lines. It's how the University of Tennessee completely lost power for an extended period of time because a rascally little squirrel decided to chew through a power line. That doesn't take into account that all of our utility systems are now cyber-based. So whether we're talking about a squirrel or the guy that calls himself Squirrel operating out of China, and as we saw in the last 24 hours, the indictments come down from the federal government of indicting members of the Chinese military for cyber hacking activities directed against U.S. industry. We know that there are people and there are things that we cannot control that are looking to disrupt our systems, which means we need to take the threat seriously to ensure that we can keep the systems running or that we have a good backup plan in the event that they don't. And that rolls right into cyber attacks, which I just referenced. And one of the things that I think we've seen a pretty hard transition of in the last year, we have moved from state-sponsored terrorism attacks on cyber issues generally to attacks which are targeted against retail. The individuals that want to engage in cyber attacks have figured out it's a lot easier to hit us in the pocketbook often than it is to go after government systems. That's why when entities linked to the Syrian government tweeted out recently that the White House had been attacked and the president had been injured, in the 5 minutes it took to debunk that tweet, the stock market took a $200 billion hit. Recovered. But when you start thinking about those numbers and you start thinking about the cost to the U.S. economy, not in those sorts of tweets that we recover from, but the actual cost is $38 billion a year, we start seeing the impact of these systems, of these attacks on our systems, and the need to take this stuff seriously. Whether it's our retail or it's our government. I like to note that Cook County is one of the largest purchasers of carbon paper in the United States, and certainly in the state of Illinois. So we are somewhat, in the past, the county has addressed cyber issues by just relying on 19th century technology. We are working very diligently we have worked very diligently over the last 36 months to make significant investments in infrastructure, hardware, and software to protect our systems. Just think about county government itself, one of the largest public health systems in the United States. The busiest courthouse in the world, the Daly Center, sits across from my office. One of the busiest medical examiner's offices in the United States. All of you probably dread, if you live in Cook County, receiving 2 pieces of mail every year, and that's your property taxes. All the property tax data, all the land deed data, all held by the county. It is critically important that we secure these systems quickly and efficiently to prevent a larger issue from occurring. And that's what we're working to do, but we need to do it in partnership, whether it's addressing cyber attack or severe weather or power outages. The only way we will make it through these issues is by working together, and that means bringing together the public sector, the private sector, the academic sector, and the nonprofit sector to think through the real threats and how we can address them. And so I'm very appreciative for the opportunity today to share with you some of the things that we're thinking about, as well as discuss some of the issues and where we need to go moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, and for everything that your team does across the board. Our next speaker is Allison Taylor, who's coming right up, from Siemens to talk about how some of their work and experiences elsewhere can be informative for us here in the Chicago region.
Thank you. So I am based in our Washington, D.C. office, and I know a lot of people think Washington, D.C. is a disaster, but for different reasons than we're talking about today. One thing that we learned, actually, after Superstorm Sandy is that if the storm had hit directly on D.C., which for many, many hours before it hit, it was actually predicted to do, the Anacostia River and the Potomac River would have flooded so severely that our entire wastewater treatment system for the entire region would have been underwater and flooded and ruined. And I can assure you that DC does not have the kind of foresight and plans that you've just heard about from Cook County. And so that's really been a wake-up call for that city to start to plan and to start to look at the inevitability of big storms and big natural disasters and how that can affect everyone there. So Siemens is a global company, as you heard. We're an infrastructure and technology company, and you may wonder, well, other than getting your technology out there, which is very important for cities and resilience, why do you care about this topic? Well, we employ a lot of people, about 60,000 here in the US, and at an event like Superstorm Sandy, we were certainly affected. Our employees were out of work for a long time. We didn't have power in many of our offices, and that was worrisome, and it also cost us money. But on behalf of our customers, we really learned a lot about how technology needs to bounce back from a disruptive event. Some of our hospital customers had equipment, imaging equipment in basements of hospitals that was completely flooded and unusable. That happened in Katrina as well. A substation that had just been installed in the basement of the new World Trade Center construction was submerged under about 8 feet of water and ruined. And so we had to help our customers through those kinds of disasters as well. We saw a lot of that firsthand. We also deploy portable drinking water and also portable imaging, medical imaging equipment in these disasters. So we've learned a lot, and we've realized that we need to continue to learn more. It's a terribly important time to start to engage with a lot of communities and cities about the topic of resilience. And one of the great things that we've learned and that you've heard this morning is that cities are beginning to really talk to one another and learn from one another. And our facilitating that network, I think, is a very important role for a company as well. So we did a study with the Regional Planning Association in the Northeast, as well as a consulting company called IRUP. And we put together something called the Toolkit for Resilient Cities, and I'll show you the site where you can take a look at that later. we found basically 5 themes around resilient infrastructure. One is robustness, meaning that the infrastructure has to be able to withstand a direct hit, basically. Redundancy, so is there additional capacity if needed, or is there a backup to provide whatever service that technology might be providing? Diversity and flexibility. What about different pathways to provide the same service? Responsiveness, this often comes through automation. Can that technology communicate to those who need to know? Emergency responders, for instance, city and county officials, and most important also, communicate to the public. And coordination, can that information be disseminated throughout the system in a usable format? No one system is perfect. In most technologies that you will look at, most systems you will look at, some of these characteristics aren't in place. And so planners have to really think about how technology has to be backed up oftentimes by non-automated types of systems as well. Planning, planning, planning is something I think we've all learned is very, very important to create a resilient community. So we focus primarily on the systems of transportation, energy, and water for obvious reasons. They're essential systems in any community. And also buildings. Buildings have not only an essential service in that they house people, and this is where people are officed, but they can also provide a lot of information to the public. They can provide a lot of information to emergency responders, and they often connect to things like the smart grid. So we've also studied how buildings can be instrumental in providing technologies that are resilient to communities. The transportation network is the first thing I want to talk about. So there are a variety of types of technologies that are important to keep the transportation network resilient in the times of a natural disaster. In DC, we think a lot about security disasters as well. Prioritize signaling for emergency vehicles. So the signaling is available either in a centralized place or on the vehicle itself, so that as that vehicle is approaching a crowded intersection, for instance, it can trigger, or a centralized control can trigger the signal turning green, so that that emergency responder can keep going where they need to go. Multimodal systems, meaning you're not just relying on light rail or underground rail or buses or other types of transportation, but multimodal choices for people who are trying to evacuate or get around the city to respond to a disaster. Real-time data for coordination so that emergency responders receive information about what's happening along the systems and can communicate that in real time to people who need to know. And also modern rail controls, if there is a rail system. For instance, a system can actually be changed somewhat so that if the system is actually directly connected, the rail system is directly connected to something like a hospital, then the energy that would be used by the rail system can be diverted directly to power a hospital in a time of greater need. Or the rail cars can be slowed either in frequency or in speed, and the energy saved can be kept on the grid and used by emergency responders in the hospitals. This takes centralized controls so that the rail cars can be timed according to need. But that's a type of technology that can be very important in a time of a natural disaster. The London Underground, for instance, also has a backup power supply. Typically, it operates on the grid, but it can operate via its own generator if needed. One type of technology, we call it CBTC, is a technology that does enable a rail system to be timed, the cars to be timed according to need. And this is actually a kind of nice thing daily, as a matter of fact, because if the rail cars are arriving more frequently, then people can get around faster. There's also usually automated technology that can tell people when the next car is coming. So this is something that communities like to utilize if they have a robust rail system, but it also can be very important in the time of emergency response. But it's not perfect, as you can see. It may not necessarily be redundant, and it actually has to have a power supply in order to operate, so it's not completely standalone. Here's an example of a city, Houston, that has been working on improving its transportation system. After Hurricane Ike, Houston realized that evacuation in particular was something that was very important to the city. Harris County is about the 3rd most populated county in the country, so there are a lot of people to get around, a lot of people to get information to, and they started partnering with the Department of Transportation, as did we, to develop technologies to get people moving faster. And in the first phase, they have put about 400 signal technologies into 400 intersections around the county that help for the signals to change at a rate that is in accordance with the traffic density approaching the intersection. And this actually works by signals recognizing smartphones that are at the intersection. They're not reading anybody's data, it's anonymous, but they're able to figure out how many cars are approaching the intersection and time the signals accordingly. This, again, is a pretty nice feature on a daily basis, but very important if you're trying to evacuate a lot of people at a short period of time. And the more people you have moving faster, the less precious fuel is wasted, because they might be sitting around for a long time otherwise, and the faster they actually get out of town. So evacuation routes are much more efficient this way. Houston has a comprehensive plan. That's just phase one. They want to have signaling technologies and traffic management technologies throughout the entire city for all types of vehicles, integrating the smartphone technologies, which of course eventually gives information to the individual driver and the individual user as well. As for the electricity grid, making that more resilient, you've probably heard of demand response. Demand response is something that a lot of people talk about, again, in daily usage, adjusting the consumption of, let's say, your appliances according to what's happening with supply, so that if your appliances are using less at off-peak hours, your electricity bill may be lower. But if you centralize that and you give an operator the chance to change that consumption and reroute the needs around the city in times of disaster, that can actually be very important to keep a city powered, and particularly its essential services powered. So, for instance, perhaps that operator could diminish power that's going to a retail establishment and send that power instead to hospitals or emergency response centers where, in a time of disaster, it's really needed. This, again, requires fairly sophisticated, centralized control, but this is certainly technology that's available today. And this is also technology that is very important in times of, let's say, extreme heat, so that the operator can sort of equalize the peaking that occurs, diminish some of the demand on the system, and the system will therefore be a lot more reliable. At the same time, it can accommodate things like renewable energy, solar energy, wind energies. So this is not just about disaster response, but it can be very important at that time. Automated monitoring would allow an operator to see throughout a system, detect a problem, correct a problem, or send crews to correct a problem before it becomes an even bigger problem. Microgrids, that's independent grids that produce and distribute energy locally, so they're independent of a problem that may be going on elsewhere on the grid. And submersible equipment. Substations can actually be submerged in water, and New York found out that might have been a good way to go. They are gas-encapsulated technologies. They tend to have a small environmental footprint. They can also be put underground so that something could, like a park, like in Anaheim, California, could be built on top of the substation. But if they can be submerged, then we can continue to provide power and put substations in areas that may be prone to flooding, realizing that that substation can probably withstand that. So these are very important technologies, again, available today, that can definitely harden a city's infrastructure and make it a lot more resilient to natural disaster. This is an example of the gas-insulated technology. That's what we call the technology that can be submerged underwater. And this is an example of a microgrid. Co-op City in the Bronx has a microgrid. And it's a fairly large area, 14,000 apartments, high-rise buildings. It operates on a microgrid that's also very energy efficient and environmentally sensitive. But the important thing in this context is that during Superstorm Sandy, these people didn't lose power. 60,000 residents kept the power on because this microgrid didn't fail. And so it's a pretty good example of how these systems can actually be very important to vital services around a city. And not only that, it's pretty affordable. It's about a 5-year payback. And in this particular area, the energy that is generated can be put back, purchased onto the grid. So that's also an economic benefit that, according to some state laws, is also available for microgrids. A water management system is key. Water is key to life, and certainly key to the healthcare industry as well. So when the water supply is threatened, that's a real problem. And we certainly saw that in almost every major disaster that you've read about in the newspapers. So important technologies here are leak detection, so that an operator, typically again from a centralized location, can find out when there's a problem on a system and can report that problem and get crews to fix that problem quickly. Not only that, there's automated distribution, which can allow the operator to actually change how the flows are working within a system, to divert the supply around a problem area so that pressure doesn't build and create a bigger problem. There's also sensors for pollution, automated sensors for pollution that can be installed throughout a system. So if there's a contamination problem, that area can be isolated, it doesn't contaminate the rest of the system, or it can be shut off so that that contaminated water doesn't go out into a water supply in a larger area. An automated dam or levee monitoring, something that the people around Hurricane Katrina would certainly have liked to have had. And this is emerging technology, but very important technology. Dams and levees are one of the solutions that a lot of cities are looking at to harden their infrastructure. And obviously, those things can fail. Even if they're built higher, even if they're built stronger, they can fail. So being able to detect problems before they happen is very important in this context. This is a levee monitoring system that is somewhat testing experimental right now in the Netherlands. We're a part of the consortium in the European Union that is looking at this technology right now. It's live monitoring, so 24/7 you can see what's happening, but it's also experimental in that a lot of weather data is incorporated into the data that the levee and the dams are creating, so that scientists can better understand how these structures are reacting to seasonal and daily changes in the weather. And then San Francisco, and we all know that San Francisco is somewhat prone to earthquakes, but you might not know that a very large earthquake, the big earthquake in 1906, actually could happen again. It was about a 7.6 on the Richter scale, and there's about a 70% chance, according to a number of scientists, that that could happen again within the next 30 years. And that would be about a $200 billion cost to the people in the Bay Area. So it's a very serious issue for a lot of reasons, not just economic, of course. So what San Francisco has been doing in cooperation with a lot of the areas around the city itself is investing about $4 billion into hardening its infrastructure. If you've been to the Golden Gate Bridge recently, you'll see a lot of signs and explanations about how that's happening, how the bridge itself is being reinforced, but also the water system is being reinforced. As you can see, 2.4 million people, there's a large population very dependent on the water supply there, and hardening that water supply in the event of a major earthquake is the goal of that program. And they're on track to complete that work by 2016, very soon. Building systems. So at this university, there's an experimental system to notify the public, to notify students and faculty about any kind of disaster that might be happening. And the purpose of this really is for others in buildings to learn about this as well. They have 192 speakers indoors to disseminate information, tell people what to do in the event of an emergency, 4 loudspeakers outdoors, but all of this connects to smartphones and individual mobile devices so that anybody can look on their smartphone and get information about what's happening and what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go. And buildings can teach us a lot too. So this building in London is a building where we're demonstrating software. It's kind of 3D simulation software to figure out how people behave inside of a building in times of emergency. And we can simulate all kinds of scenarios in order to learn about how to better build buildings, how to better plan around disasters, how to better disseminate information to people, and what they're going to do when they receive that information. So it's a very important learning tool. Buildings can actually teach us a lot. And finally, I won't say too much about this because I think you've seen probably the best example of this in Michael's presentation, planning. None of this can be connected to people, can be connected to responders, or can be connected to decision makers without planning, without thinking ahead, as you have seen Cook County is doing, and incorporating all areas of decision making. And that certainly includes the private sector as well, the healthcare sector, transportation sector, et cetera. Everybody has to be included. Everybody has a role. From our point of view, technology works if everybody understands how it works and everybody is able to receive usable information, regardless of what your use may be, certainly in a time of disaster. So, if you'd like to learn more about our toolkit and more about the technologies that I mentioned, they can all be found online on our website, and it's an interactive website in this case as well. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. And on that theme of planning, which is, of course, is our middle name, we have Jim Schwab here, who's been working on this same issue for a long time. So, Jim Schwab from the American Planning Association. It's very timely. They have a report coming out soon on the best practices in this field, and he's going to talk more about that. Take it away, Jim.
Okay.
And when Jim's done, we'll have question and answer. Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. And yes, it's been a long time. I want to take a second. Well, first, I have to say I need to download all this stuff that they presented. This is great material. And I have learned a lot listening to them so far. But the American Planning Association for several years now has had that Hazards Planning Research Center that you see listed there. It's actually part of 3 centers that we run within our research operation, the other 2 being on green communities and planning and community health. But the partnerships involving hazards actually go back much further, more than 20 years, to work with FEMA, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Forest Service, NOAA in recent years, and some other entities that we have partnered with to take a look at issues related to planning for natural hazards and how we deal with the kinds of issues you've just been hearing about. And I want to walk you through some of what we've been doing recently. You're going to get a little bit more of a national view in my instance, because that's sort of where I live time-wise. We, as you can tell, work with a lot with national agencies. We're a national organization of 40,000 members spread across all of the U.S. and some places overseas where our members work. One of the things that we have coming out very shortly is this report. That's the cover. It's not out yet. It will be out a little later this year. We're finishing up the revisions at the moment. But about 16 years ago, I think it was 1998, we did an earlier version of this called Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery and Reconstruction that really laid out a lot of the original guidelines, a lot of the original concepts about the value of planning before a disaster occurs for what recovery would look like after that disaster happens. That was sort of a new concept to a lot of people at the time, and it has not necessarily gotten lots of traction, but I think it is gaining a lot of steam recently. That cover, by the way, shows some tidal wetlands in Brooklyn, New York. We decided to put an emphasis on green infrastructure in this report. That's in concert with the fact that if you look at the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force report, you'll find a good deal of emphasis on green infrastructure, and I'll talk more in a second about why that is. But I also want to introduce you to some of the other resources we have already produced, because we've worked on a number of different kinds of disaster types. We have a whole series of reports that I'm not going to go into here, but one of them that is extremely important in this context and sets some of the stage for what we're doing now is this one that we did about 4 years ago. This was released, called Hazard Mitigation, Integrating Best Practices into Planning. And I'm going to take a second to talk to you about what that actually was all about, but I do want to make clear that that is freely downloadable at FEMA, or you can order a print copy from us. But the idea was that the greatest value of planning to mitigate hazards could be achieved not by doing what many communities had been doing since the passage of the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 that set up the hazard mitigation plans, one of which is being now done by Cook County that Michael Masters was talking about, but by integrating the substance of those plans into the local comprehensive plans that communities were already doing. So we're talking here about the interface between disaster issues and traditional forms of urban planning, which often have not confronted those issues, even though if you look back at the history of urban planning, a great deal of its foundation was in public safety, protecting the public from various kinds of nuisances. The nuisance law was the foundation of the seminal case in the U.S. Supreme Court way back in 1926 that laid the foundation for the constitutionality of zoning. Public health concerns drove a lot of the early foundations of urban planning, and we've tended to kind of forget some of that over the years, even as our disaster problems have grown in severity. So we advocated, and we're with full support from FEMA on this, and I'll talk about more of that in a second, the value of integrating hazard mitigation as a planning priority in all aspects of the local planning process. Now, when I say all aspects, I mean that second bullet point with its subpoints, what we call our strategic points of intervention, the visioning and goal-setting activities that go on in a community, getting hazard mitigation out there as a priority. All aspects of plan making, not just exclusively the comprehensive plan, also looking at other kinds of plans that communities develop, but particularly in the case of the comprehensive plan, the issue of, is there some place in that comprehensive plan where you directly confront the issue of the hazards that exist in that community? Now, you can do this in a way that directly borrows from the contents of that local hazard mitigation plan. And so even if, as in Cook County, you're talking about a big multi-hazard, multi-community plan, and there are these provisions in the Disaster Mitigation Act for doing exactly that, multi-jurisdictional plans, where is the intersection between that content and, say, the plan, the comprehensive plan in the city of Chicago, which doesn't actually have one at the moment, or Glencoe or Oak Park or all these other places? Where do they draw upon that to address the issues of hazard mitigation that they need to look at within their own confines? So all kinds of plan making. And then we also talked in there about the linkages between other plan elements and that hazard mitigation element or some kind of hazard related element in the plan, such as transportation. Are there some bridges that need to be elevated to get them above flood stage? Where's the link between that and the things that you're talking about in that hazard mitigation element? Now, I want to mention very quickly before I move on that this is not so unusual, even if you haven't heard of this approach before. There are about 10 states across the country, mostly in states that already require comprehensive planning, most of which are actually outside the Midwest, that actually require that there be some kind of hazard-related element in the local comprehensive plan. California, safety element. Similar kinds of requirements in Arizona and Nevada. Idaho does it, believe it or not. Florida, and some other southeastern states requiring coastal-related elements that get at these issues. Then we talked about the implementation tools, because somewhere you have to then hitch this to zoning and subdivision regulations and those kinds of land development tools that are part of the regulatory system in the local community. And one of the values of integrating all this into the local comprehensive plan is that unlike the hazard mitigation plan itself, which is a valuable tool, for one thing, it gets you access to the federal grant money, which is extremely important, is the fact that the comprehensive plan has a unique standing as a policy tool for local government that then has value in the legal setting, establishes the foundation for zoning. Many states actually require that zoning and land development be tied in some fashion consistently with what's in that plan. There are various degrees of this requirement. One of the important things that actually happened in New Orleans after Katrina was that 3 years later, in November of 2008, the voters approved a charter amendment that said that in the future, zoning and land development activities would have to be consistent with a new master plan, which they had not actually created yet, but did adopt a couple of years later. This was a huge step forward in New Orleans in terms of moving these issues forward. Development work, you can integrate this then down into the level of things like site plan review and redevelopment plans and so on. And then capital programming, follow the money. Where's the money being allocated, prioritized to get the mitigation done? And in order to help all that, we then provided, this was developed by a fellow named Dave Gottschalk, who is a professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina, a dean of hazard mitigation for the last 40 years or so, a safe growth audit. So you can get at that, and it basically allows you to walk through all of your ordinances and provisions to see where there might be weak spots, and we then had him also flesh that out in an article in Zoning Practice, which is a free download. You can get at it there. And on the right-hand side, while we won't go into all that detail, you can see the kinds of things that it covers. A lot of issues related to, the subdivision, site plan reviews, zoning, all the basic land use tools. So there's a tool that communities can use to then do that kind of analysis. And in fact, with the help of a consultant, that has been used down in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, the other report that I mentioned first, Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery Next Generation, has a number of major themes that I think you'd like to know about. One of them deals with resilience. I won't go into that in great detail here, except to say that one of the things that we just consider a critical piece here is that there is a direct tie between the quality of local governance and the resilience of the community. Poorly governed communities tend not to be terribly resilient. Well-governed communities, different matter. I'll go into more of that with an example a little later, but I want to cover some of these other points real quickly. The green infrastructure, the ability to combine environmental objectives with hazard mitigation, and to begin to anticipate climate change, which is a very different issue here in Chicago than it might be in New York City, where that picture came from. There, they're dealing with sea level rise. In the context of Chicago, it's much less clear that that's even an issue with Lake Michigan. What might actually happen, but this is not really settled science yet, is some decline in lake level because of reduced precipitation, but that may be a function of drought. A city like Chicago is probably not in great danger in terms of water supplies because it does have Lake Michigan. But think about this. The divide between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi River watershed is somewhere on the southwest side of this city on a ridge that's only about 20 feet above the level of the lake. The watershed for the Great Lakes, for the most part, is a very thin veneer outside those lakes, with some exceptions. And so you have lots of other communities in a state like Illinois that are very dependent on other sources of water, other rivers or groundwater. We did actually another report on planning and drought, which is, I think, going to be an emerging issue that people have to pay more attention to. What do you do when that water starts to run dry? And how do you incorporate that into your plans? One of the other things we did was include a model pre-event recovery ordinance. This is also on our website. You go to planning.org/research/post-disaster, and you can get at all of this stuff. One of the things we're doing, in addition to just simply producing that report, is we've put up a lot of online resources there for you, including something called the Recovery News blog, which is started in April of 11, so there's more than 3 years worth of material out there that you can tap. So, there's a good deal of stuff there, including some, explanation how to understand the new federal structures that are out there. One of the things we want people to understand is there are different kinds of recovery plans. Some that are just primarily focused on short-term recovery and response issues. But an important one is these pre-disaster plans. I'm going to go into that a bit more, and then post-disaster. There are some differences that we outline in some detail in terms of what you can do and think about before the disaster ever occurs to begin to establish what your recovery should look like. versus the things that have to wait until you know the contours of the actual damage that's occurred. So some of the advantages of thinking about this and actually developing a recovery plan before the event, the opportunity, as in some of the training that Michael was talking about, to build a local culture of disaster awareness, just raise the public buy-in, to exercise these activities with the local officials and various departments to cooperate on that, to establish some clear lines of responsibility. That's in that ordinance that I just mentioned, to think about the financial needs of post-disaster recovery, and to improve your overall stance of preparedness. Does anybody do this? You might be asking. Yes, and in fact in Florida, some time ago, they put into the state statute a requirement for a post-disaster redevelopment plan developed as guidance. Under the current governor, they have retreated a bit by removing the mandate, but still encouraging this, and they actually developed as guidance out of a series of prototypes in 5 counties and 1 city in Florida, one of which was Hillsborough County, which is the Tampa-St. Petersburg area, which is very much aware that it is a community that is very lucky. For the last 60 years, they've had lots of near misses, but not a direct hit from a hurricane, and they've got maps that show where, you know, all the tracks that have gone up and around and behind them, and they know it's a matter of time. And so they have developed this, and one of the things they talk about is priority redevelopment areas, actually looking at where, once we have a hurricane, once we have all that damage, where will we steer the redevelopment that has to occur and away from the more hazardous areas in the community. Some things have to wait, of course. You can't get everything figured out ahead of time. And so, you know, damage assessments obviously will help you then establish the scope and location of the damage, help you figure out where you need to do that development, get the public participation then to focus on the kinds of things that need to happen afterwards, and then begin to focus on the planning and urban design that has to deal with those affected areas. Very quickly, just to wrap up, one of the best examples, and we like to develop a couple poster children with each of these projects. In the case of post-disaster recovery, one of them that we think did it very well, in fact we gave them an award a couple of years ago, was Cedar Rapids with the flood recovery from 2008. I won't go into this in detail because I'm getting the high five signal, but they did a really banner job on so many fronts that I could give a whole speech just about Cedar Rapids. One of the things that they did, you know, many communities like New Orleans lose population after one of these big events where they've had really taken a hammer blow from Mother Nature. Cedar Rapids actually gained 4% in population in the 5 years after those floods, in part because of a very deliberate effort to make sure that an adequate supply of affordable housing got rebuilt in other parts of the city after the event. Part of a number of various initiatives that they undertook to make sure that their city rebounded effectively. And you can see some of the things that they did to work their plan, to reinvest in the community, to make good use of the state and federal money that was available to them in order to make the kind of progress that they wanted to make. And I invite you to take a very close look at some of that. So one of the conclusions I want to leave you with, I think communities will gradually spend more time thinking about planning for recovery before disasters happen, even though they haven't historically done that. I think that there are going to be more federal incentives to try to encourage that kind of activity. And I think states are going to have to start thinking, even though they haven't historically, about expanding their role in supporting recovery planning. And we can talk about some of the ways in which that could happen, but it's clear looking at New York and New Jersey and the states up in the Northeast after Sandy that this is a really serious issue for many communities, is what is that relationship with the state and what is the state doing to facilitate recovery? And there are various ways, and that also ties into this last point, which is that there are a lot of ways in which regional planning agencies and county agencies can also play a role in helping their communities to achieve disaster recovery effectively. And so with that, I'll leave you with my contact information, and I guess we'll start our questions.
So we do have time for a few questions, and I think all of our speakers are going to hang out for a few minutes after we're done, because we will not get through everybody's questions. Scott, my colleague, is going to walk around with the microphone, so just wait till he is there to ask a question. But I'm going to ask the first one, prerogative of the mic. Jim just mentioned the counties working with other counties. Michael, I was wondering if you could talk about for our regional transportation and water systems and other infrastructure systems that don't stop at county borders. What is Cook County, how are you working with surrounding counties to coordinate on everything that you do at a larger regional scale?
Well, I think the first component of that is recognizing that things don't stop at arbitrary, politically designed borders until the day that, MERS decides, oh, I've got to Austin Boulevard, I'm not crossing from Chicago into Oak Park, or water or otherwise. So I think this really starts with relationship building first and foremost. So I spent a lot of the first 12 months I was in this position getting very familiar with my GPS system and learning how to get everywhere. Literally traveling to all of the regional counties. So we did a fair amount of that. I'm happy to say that we've built a lot of those relationships, because the worst time to be meeting somebody is when you're walking into a command center or on the scene of an incident. And I can tell you, with referencing MERS or something like that, the communication pathways are working every day in terms of collaborating. But beyond the communication, there needs to be a shared respect for priorities. And I think a lot of the systems that Siemens is working on, that Allison spoke about, and otherwise, are all phenomenal systems, but you need to get people to buy into the idea that water is really critical, that microgrid systems make sense. And that's a little bit of a harder proposition, particularly with government who's trying to upkeep with institutional infrastructure that has not had heavy investment for a long time, or that's suffering. I mean, we still have water pipes in this city that were built during President Grant's administration, which I guess is a lasting legacy.
That's the 1870s for history.
So, but I think the relationship building is a priority. The reality is we're so diverse. I mean, when you think about Cook County, 134 jurisdictions, 30 unincorporated townships, hundreds of taxing bodies, which again, if you look at your property tax bill, you realize that. We've got to start small and then work out, and I think there needs to be a recognition from the federal government that needs to happen a little bit more. We had a very successful regional catastrophic grant program. 3 states, 22 counties ultimately involved, dealing with transportation, evacuation, and things like that. But at the same time that was happening, and that was ongoing for a number of years, the city and the county previously weren't speaking to one another. So how are you trying to do a planning effort where you're engaging an entire 3 states when 2 major stakeholders have not come to the table to really have a serious conversation about doing the planning between the city of Chicago and Oak Park, or the city of Chicago and Evanston, with the county being a stakeholder in that? So I think we've worked on that a bit. The other complication is, of course, grant funds. So the regional catastrophic was defunded, just like the community emergency response program was defunded. So you spend 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years building up resiliency, building up preparedness, and then the funding goes away. Now, that I can't control, but what that means is it's all the more important for us to have the conversation of how, as stakeholders on the local level, do we step in to engage that program to make sure that the preparedness initiatives and the muscle memory that was built up doesn't language or atrophy.
Thank you, Michael. We have time for a few questions. If we see any hands. Cannot be possible. Jim in the back. Scott, you know him well. Wait for the microphone, Jim. Thank you. Jim Mann, longtime MPC board member.
Question actually for all 3 of you, and that goes, Chicago region is a rail hub in all the counties. With all the spills that are occurring, how do we approach that in the sense of resiliency and responsiveness?
Hello, there we go. One of the first things, and it goes right back to partnerships, first we had to meet all of our rail partners. So literally, we've sat down, sent letters out to all of our rail partners, whether it's CN or Union Pacific, to meet with them and speak with them about what their threats and hazards are, and then we've done the same thing. Some partners are more willing than others to do that. I think that there are a lot of good systems in place on the federal level in terms of cataloging and researching and indexing what is being carried and where it's being carried to. A flaw in the system is that that information does not make it down with the speed and sort of integrity that it needs to our local communities. So what good is knowing what's going through a community if the cop that's driving up to the derailed tanker or the fireman has no clue what's in the tanker? It's completely useless, other than it's going to be a finding after the fact that now we know why 17 firemen lost their lives or 22 police officers. So we need to do a much, much better job on the governmental level, and I think that private industry can drive that. I think that's a good role for them as a partner to say we're fully responsive to giving you this information, but we want to make sure that when we're having the conversation that local government and our local first responders are in the room during the conversation. The requirements are written in such a way that it's not a check the box, but it is actually actionable intelligence for us.
I very much agree with that. I think that there are some federal programs in place for tracking substances. Another example that comes to mind is the big spill in West Virginia, which affected the water supply so severely for a number of days. And it was a long time before there was very certain knowledge of what that spill was. And then even longer, if even today, there was speculation about, well, what exactly are the health effects here? So certainly at a federal level, there could be a lot more work done on enforcing laws that actually are in place for inventories, for major stocks of chemicals and hazardous substances. But at the local level, as Michael was saying, you could have a terrific inventory, you could have great knowledge somewhere in the state capitol or Washington, D.C., but the person who has to show up at a site and do something about it immediately has to know a lot more. They don't know what kind of response to provide if they don't have that real-time information. There is technology that can provide the information to the responder and to the local governments, but it's really not a technology issue so much as it is the willingness to create that database and to have the data to go to the local responders to begin with.
I want to give you an example from a year ago, but there's a report that just came out Friday last week from the Texas State Fire Marshal's office. This is not a transportation thing, but it highlights that the extra challenges involved in something like railroads and also the need for the public-private cooperation that goes into anticipating something like a rail accident where you have with any kind of hazardous materials or substances or explosive materials. Just last month, I was on a panel on land use and planning for the Chemical Safety Board, which is a federal agency that is responsible for investigating chemical safety accidents. And the hearing was in West Texas. The town is named West, not Western Texas. This is where, you may recall from watching the news, a year ago there was this big explosion in a fertilizer facility that killed 15 people, 10 of them firefighters. One of the findings is that now here we are dealing with a fixed facility that everybody knew was in town, and yet the firefighters were not trained adequately for how to handle ammonium nitrate, which is the material in fertilizers that is explosive and in fact is the same material that Timothy McVeigh used in the Oklahoma City bombing, if it gives you some idea of its potency. And so in the space of 20 minutes from the alert when all the volunteer firefighters rushed to the scene and the time that that exploded, there was not the adequate understanding of what they were up against. And had there been, they probably would have retreated from the scene knowing that there's a good chance we're all going to lose our lives if we don't get out of here. There's a lot of other issues connected to that in terms of the development that was allowed over the years. Why was there a nursing home within 250 yards of that facility? Same questions could be asked in many cases along rail lines, given those problems. The extra challenge that I mention this because the extra challenge that then goes with railroads that is different from something like West, where you have a fixed facility that's sitting there that you know is there, is knowing what is actually on each of those train cars coming through. And when you look at the sheer volume in a place like Cook County, it does get pretty frightening, and it's a major challenge, and it certainly highlights the need for some very effective communication systems to get that information to the responders in a timely fashion.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to ask one more question. Dan had his hand up. One particularly insightful, potent, useful question. Dan.
The question that I'm Dan Mills, doctoral candidate at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and urban planning there. The question that I had actually relates to about identity, and with resilience, we're talking about maintaining an identity over time. And my question relates to with climate change, we can expect an identity that looks more like an ecological identity that maybe looks more like Dallas or Houston than it does look like Chicago, and we're stuck with a infrastructure that sounds like most of it or some of it was built in the 19th century. So at what point do we start to question whether our cultural heritage is actually, or our attachment to our cultural heritage is actually failing us or not allowing us to build a resilient city in the future?
Who wants to take that one? Good grief. Boy, you really went for the throat with that one. Because I don't even know offhand the sheer tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars worth of real estate sitting in this city, and how much of that is vulnerable as a result of those climate changes that you're talking about. That is, that really highlights the level of planning challenge that awaits us in coming years to just begin to inventory that situation, to begin to understand where those challenges are going to be. And it raises, in my mind, the question of whether we really understand the kinds of resources we need to put into planning to be able to understand what we're up against. I could give you some examples in other settings, such as, this is not climate change, but in Los Angeles, it took them about 20 years, I think, to begin to work through the process of figuring out the stock of unreinforced masonry construction that they had that was vulnerable to earthquakes, and to begin to put the mitigation in place to deal with that. And what you're bringing up is probably an even bigger question.
With respect to climate change in particular, I'm sure you're aware that there's been a robust debate for some time about mitigation versus adaptation. And there's sides. Some say we don't want to go into adaptation, meaning the inevitable is we will continue to see the effects of climate change, therefore we must plan. We want to stay on the mitigation side and try to do everything we possibly can and be pure in our focus to stem the climate change effects to begin with. What I can say is in most cities, we see that there's robust attention and programs on both sides. That mitigation is alive and well. Cities have very strenuous goals, many of them do, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. They're putting in energy efficiency requirements with respect to their buildings. They're acquiring technology in order to do what they can to get cars off the road, for instance. And there are all kinds of benefits, like a perhaps healthier society and cultural issues that they can cite to for doing that as well. We don't see cities ignoring that side of the equation. At the same time, something like Superstorm Sandy or any natural event that affects your community is pretty focusing. And so I think that cities are learning from those events, learning that mitigation shouldn't stop, but that planning for disasters is absolutely imperative, and that the two can work in tandem, can work together, and are both very important.
Final word, Michael.
I mean, I agree with what's been said. A lot of this is really an emotional argument, right? I mean, we're having this discussion. I can tell you, because we engage in predictive analytics of where rain has gone and where it's going to come, of what makes sense in terms of a Pareto optimal decision to buy out houses. And that sounds good for all of us in this room, unless it is your house. And then you have a very different reaction to my proposition. Or maybe you don't. Maybe, but at the point that we're having that discussion, we're talking about what makes the most economic sense, but economics doesn't work on feelings. And I think that requires really a very just honest conversation about what we want to be looking at. Where does it make the most sense to make investments in our society? Because at the same time we're talking about in some communities, does it make sense to buy you out or for you to stay there and continue to rebuild? We're talking about a much different problem in certain parts of this county. We have some of the wealthiest communities, and we have some of the most disenfranchised and challenged communities. And the problems of preparedness and response are very, very different, right? Because, and we saw this in Washington County, Illinois as well. They did not qualify for federal assistance, for public assistance, because the value, quote unquote, of what was destroyed didn't reach what the federal government says was a level wherein they would step in and rebuild. But the entire town was gone, right? We have a situation here in this urban area where you can have a building that is on one side of Cook County and the same building on the other side of the line in DuPage or Lake County, both get completely destroyed by the same storm system. But the way the system is set up from the federal government, DuPage or Lake County will be able to rebuild that that building completely, and the one in Cook County will not at all, because of the level of damage we need to reach. And who that impacts the most are not the wealthy communities. They are not the privileged communities. Who that impacts the most are the individuals that are most on the social perimeter, so to speak. And those are the individuals and entities that we need to look out for the most. And I think that requires a holistic conversation about who we are as a society and where we want to go. And it moves us beyond the discussion of, are we going to pay to rebuild your house or not, and into a much larger discussion of where we need to think about where our future is going to be holistically.
Thank you, Michael. It's a very sobering reminder that this is not all about rain, it's about people and how we make decisions. Thank you all very much. I do want to highlight that if you enjoyed today's event, we have several others coming up in the very near future, including one today, later this afternoon, at 5 o'clock with Eric Kleinenberg, whose author has actually written a lot about resiliency issues. So you could come back and ask him his thoughts. He'll actually be here to talk about a book of his called Going Solo, which is another issue of resiliency that as more and more and more and more and more people in all aspects and phases of life are living alone, are our communities or our housing stock or services that we provide adapting to meet that growing demographic trend, whether it's millennials or seniors or widows or ex-convicts. That is tonight from 5 to 7. There will be beer and wine at that event. A lot of what MPC does is think about the future of regional planning. Jim asked this question. Next week, next Thursday, and all these flyers are outside, we have an event about the future, the update of the Regional Comprehensive Plan. Michael's boss, President Preckwinkle, will be here, as well as Leanne Redden from the RTA and Mayor Tom Weisner from the city of Aurora for a talk about the future of regional planning here in our region. And then June 19th, we have an event, a very different event. You may think, based on the topic today, that we're talking about combined sewer overflows. This is actually the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Their outgoing director, Deborah Rutter, is coming here for a talk about anchor institutions like that, the role of music in communities. Should be a very different event. All of these flyers are outside. I encourage you to come back, to bring a friend, to bring a colleague, and to stay tuned for other things that we have coming up. So Thank you to Michael. Thank you to Allison. Thank you to Jim. Thank you to Siemens. Matthias was here, and we have lots of Siemens folks here in the back. And thank you to all of you for spending your lunch 90 minutes with us. Have a nice day.